I would love to actually know what the casting process was like instead of just saying a Jew should have been in that role.
Welcome to Culturally Jewish. I'm Ilana Zakon, and my co-host David Sklar abandoned us to go to Hawaii. Join us as we explore Jewish art, culture, and identity in Canada. On this week's episode, we sit down with casting director Jess Greenberg.
Mama always wanted me to be a doctor, but I became an artist and that really shocked her. Now I'm interviewing people in the biz, pros and newish, but all of them are artists and they're culturally Jewish.
Hey Jess, so can you give a little intro about who you are?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jess. I'm a casting director here in Montreal. I am from Montreal, born and raised, and I started out in film and TV about 12-ish years ago now, and fell into casting in one of my contracts, and here we are.
What do you love about working as a casting director? What are your favorite parts about it?
I love working with talent and actors, and I really love seeing a project from creation to end product. So I find it really cool to be involved in the casting because you're sort of working with it at the script level and then all the work that goes into it and then seeing the final product.
And you have a podcast too. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I co-host a podcast called Book the Room with Susanna Lanier, who is an actor and acting coach as well. And we talk about the industry and the realities of it, getting into it, staying in it, staying the course, and different things like that.
So we're at an interesting time right now, just in terms of casting in general, because as I think most people know, there was a really big strike that happened for most of last year. So what's your forecast for the coming year? Is it already getting busy now that we're back from the holidays, or it's still like a slow ease back in?
It is still a little slow on my end, at least. I don't know about other casting directors, but it is still slow. And it was also just like a good wake-up call to realize how dependent we are on American,
On the US.
on American projects. We are so dependent on it. And I would really love to see more funding in Canada and in English Quebec for local productions so that we're not just a service provider city, that we could actually, survive on our own work being done here.
Right. Because right now, I think Toronto, maybe Winnipeg, like there are some parts of Canada that are getting Canadian productions, but not so much here, not so much in Vancouver.
Exactly.
Which is
I think Toronto
interesting.
there's, the more I hear about different funding programs, the English funding programs, a lot of those funds are being given to outside of Quebec, not to Quebec English speaking creators.
And that's a tax thing, right?
Well, the funding for like development or actual production, I don't think it's tax credits. I think the credits are an issue for productions coming in from the US because it's not so desirable to work here. There's not many credits anymore. We used to have great ones, which is when I think we were booming, probably in the 90s-ish, right? Early 2000s is when things were really going great here.
Unfortunately, before both of us were working professionally in the industry, I was a little kid.
Exactly. But even as a kid, there was so much youth television programming that I'm sure you got to work on, which doesn't seem to exist anymore.
Totally. Yeah. All my favorite shows were a lot of them were being shot here, voiced here. There's so many cartoons back in that day that were being like all the original voices. It was definitely a high. So let's hope that things change and maybe this is a bit of a moment for us to make those changes after the strike.
Yeah.
So, okay. Let's talk about Jewish casting. There's a really big shift happening in our industry in general over the past few years in regards to authentic representation in casting. So for those of you who may not be familiar with that term, basically there's a call for specific ethnic groups to be played by people of that ethnic group, or if you're queer, then there's a call for people who are actually queer to play those roles, if you're disabled, stuff like that. You've been working in casting, like you said, for over 10 years. Before we get into the Jewish part of this, can you speak to how you've experienced that shift as a casting director
Yeah, well, I think, and not only for film and TV, but also in video games, it's a huge push,
Right, that's
so we
true.
don't even see the people, but they want to be authentic in the casting. So
Mhm.
I think it's great. Representation is so important. So the fact that there is a push for that in ways where it should be seen. I think sometimes there's these quotas from networks that seem a little icky,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, we're storytellers and you want to tell authentic stories, so cast authentically. But sometimes the quotas, when it coming from the top, that just seems icky to me.
Have you had any experiences where you had to deal with that, the quota thing?
Yeah, absolutely. When you're dealing with studios or networks, they have funders, they have advertising, so they have different agendas than the actual creatives, than the storytellers themselves. So that's when sort of the business and the politics cross over with
Hmm.
the arts, I guess.
Do you feel like it's changed the industry and your work as a casting director?
I think that it's made me, I guess, more sensitive to all of it, and just more aware in a positive way. As a casting director, I could only do so much, like based on the timeline, the budget, sometimes I could only look locally. So,
Mhm.
I'm dealing with a set pool of actors and talent, and I may not have the budget to look elsewhere to then
To
cast
find that
authentically.
specific person.
So
Right.
I think that sometimes we have boundaries and we can't, although we would like to do certain things, sometimes we can't.
So, as you probably know where I'm going with this, there have been a lot of Jewish actors, comedians, artists, especially in the US, who have spoken up about how Jews are not often included in this fight for authentic representation, but actually blatantly excluded. And very recently, just in the past week, over 260 Hollywood actors signed a letter to the Film Academy critiquing Jewish exclusion from diversity standards. So some of the people that signed it were Mayim Bialik, David Schwimmer, Deborah Messing. And just for context, the Academy standards from 2020 describes a number of identities that it considers underrepresented groups, and Jews are not on the list. So in this letter that they put together, I'll quote, while we applaud the Academy's efforts to increase diverse and authentic storytelling, an inclusion effort that excludes Jews is both steeped in and misunderstands antisemitism. It erases Jewish peoplehood and perpetuates myths of Jewish whiteness, power, and that racism against Jews is not a major issue or that it's a thing of the past. Then they go on to explain how Judaism isn't only a religion and that many people are white passing despite our history of persecution and exile. They say that excluding Jews in the list implies that we're overrepresented in films, which they say is not really the case, and that the few Jewish movies that are out there are often about the Holocaust, or if they have Jewish characters, they're either really disconnected from their Judaism or they're really overly stereotypical Jewish characters, and often they're played by non-Jews. So they're basically saying, include us in this fight, and not only just in the casting, but also behind the scenes for writers and consultants to be included, to include their what they call expertise, pride, cultural competency, so that we don't fall into these stereotypes. Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. So, first off, from a casting perspective, what are your thoughts on this letter? And have you had these conversations before in the casting room?
Well, for starters, I support this letter. I think there's a weird prejudice that like we are so powerful and we have so
Yeah.
much money and power, and like I don't get it. So, personally, I haven't had the chance to work on a Jewish production or to, a Jewish story where I would have loved to cast Jewish actors. So, I mean, just there's not many Jewish stories being told,
Mhm.
at least that are here in
Montreal,
Montreal.
yeah. Do you think that this letter, at this current moment with what's going on, do you think that will help or hurt our cause? Because I have to admit, when I saw it, even though I agree with everything that's said, I've had these conversations before. Part of me was like, oh, like, is this the right time? Even though in the letter, they talk about how there's so much anti Semitism right now with what's going on in the Middle East, and it's more important to be having these conversations. part of my fear is that the angry mob who's going after all of the Jews right now are just going to get angrier and not really read the letter and understand what they're trying to say and perpetuate more of this anti-Semitism. I recently listened to an episode of Barry Weiss's podcast that someone had sent me where she actually argues against the whole shift of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a hot take, but one thing that stood out to me was that she was saying, do we really want to be included in this fight to be victims and oppressed? Because maybe that's not what we want. It was just something that came into my head because I think there's arguments for it on both sides.
I think what's important is to actually split the two. I think part of the problem is that people see Jews as Israel. So I think it shouldn't have an effect on everything that's going on in the world. Although, yes, there
It
is a
shouldn't.
rise in anti-Semitism. Yes, of course it shouldn't. But because of the rise, I don't think it should hold us back from fighting for things that are important, separate from what's going on in the world. And Jews are a minority. That is fact. So I think that it is important to be included in the diversity pushes in film and TV.
So a couple of things come to mind for me. One is David Baddiel's book, Jews Don't Count, which I haven't read yet, but it's on my list. I've heard great things about it, and his whole thing is like the shift in the extreme rights and left, and how Jews like really are kind of excluded in both.
Yeah.
And then there's also famously Sarah Silverman talks about what she calls Jew face. I listened to an episode of her podcast to prepare for this episode, and she's kind of saying a lot of what they say in this letter. One point that stood out to me was that often Jewish characters that are more like positively portrayed, that are deserving of love, that are courageous, are often played by non-Jews. You see this in Mrs. Maisel, for example. She gives like 10 examples. And the ones that kind of break that mold are the ones that are written by Jewish writer actors like Broad City or the stuff that Sarah Silverman herself is doing. So what do you think about, should Jews be played by Jews? I know you were saying you agree with the letter, authentic representation. Sarah basically says it's not the fault of the actor. If like it's not Rachel Brosnahan's fault for taking the role, she's a great actor, she did a great job. But then you kind of question the other side of it is like the people making the decisions.
Yeah.
So where do you think the line is of like, is it ever okay for a non-Jew to play a Jew, or should it just be like a black and white? No, just like everyone else.
Listen, I think it's okay because like where do you draw the line for the actor? Do you know what like part of what acting is you want to choose the person who will best bring that role to life, And I guess coming from a casting point of view where I have been limited in terms of resources of what I can do, I'd be lying if I say I didn't cast doing the docudrama and having to find, the lookalikes. And the person who I had to match was like Japanese Filipino. There's not an actor who looked like him who was also Japanese Filipino. Like, so it's like you try and do the best matches. And I know that's a little different because it's docudrama, but still we're representing and casting real people and matching real people in their real stories. So, I mean, I think it's a big conversation in terms of casting and acting in general. And sometimes I don't know where that line is. And so I wouldn't want to put heat on the production because I don't know, maybe they did audition, for something like Mrs. Maisel, who seemingly had a huge budget, probably a lot of time to cast those leads. I would love to actually know what the casting process was like instead of just saying a Jew should have been in that role. I don't know what they did, I know there were other Jews cast. I know that, so yeah, I don't like to assume that the work wasn't done because coming from a casting perspective, there's sometimes limits and who knows what they did. So although yes,
Right.
it would have been great and cool and amazing to have seen that, maybe they did the work and she was the right person to role.
I think the thing that bothers me about the whole situation is that there feels like there's a hypocrisy going on in the industry. Kind of going back to the letter, it's like if everyone had that perspective of what you just said, it's like, there are budget constraints. Sometimes you kind of just have to go with the best actor, and you kind of have to be a little bit more lenient, even though like you want to do the best job with authentic casting. I feel like if this was any other ethnic or minority group, people would go nuts, like sub out Jew for literally any other minority. So that's where I feel like we get left out. And it makes me even think about what's going on right now in the news at Harvard and Penn, and how that's kind of, to me, what the issue is that they set these standards of like, we're going to fire you if you do XYZ in the left wing kind of agenda. But if it's like Jewish, then no, that's okay. Like genocide to Jews is fine. So to me, it's like the consistency is lacking. And I think that's where the hole for me is in the industry in regards to Jewish casting. I've been finding for myself, and I do audition in more than just Montreal. I audition in Vancouver and sometimes Toronto as well. I've definitely been getting more Jewish audition roles than I've ever had before in the last few years, whether it's like the Hanukkah Hallmark movies or like I auditioned for Little Bird, an Indigenous Jewish show. Do you notice a difference on this issue in terms of like Canadian projects versus American projects? I know you were saying like you don't get as many local shows, but like is there a difference in terms of like the authentic representation and what people are asking for here versus in the US, do you think? Or it's pretty much the same?
I would say it's the same. Yeah, like the big, CBC is a big broadcaster here in Canada, and then you have the streaming services, Amazon, Netflix, and yeah, I would say both of them have their quotas, and then beyond that, it's the stories that they choose to put forward and to tell. They always have different, I guess, themes of, maybe it's their focus is feminism, maybe their focus is what like and anything. So I think it changes with the, unfortunately feels like trends,
Right.
I think
On a
theater does a great job. There's a lot of Jewish theater, especially in Montreal, and I think that's a great place, at least here, to tell Jewish stories. That's a positive, I think.
We're very lucky here for sure to have the
Yeah.
Siegel Center. I mean, there's only like a small handful of Jewish theater companies in Canada, but we're very lucky to have Montreal.
Yeah.
So, kind of changing gears a little bit, looking at Jewish actors, which we do have Jewish actors in Montreal, not a huge amount, but there are some. Do you find that ever when someone is quote unquote like super Jewy, like whether it's their name, their look, which people might stereotype as being very Jewish, do you think that pigeonholes them as like, oh, like you're only really gonna get a Jewish part? Because like you look at trends from like the 90s and backwards, and a lot of people were changing their last names. You don't see that as much now. So I'm just curious, like, is that something that you ever see like in your work, or when you're watching shows, are you like, oh, like this person, like I always kind of see them as being Jewish even when they're like cast as something else?
Not necessarily. I think that comes down to the performance, so that comes down, to the performance, the skill. And if I know someone naturally who maybe speaks a bit more Jewish, or Yiddish, and throws that in, but then, I have a self-tape or an audition with them and they pull it off, like, yes, of course, some people get stereotyped, but that happens with anything. It's like, oh, that person's a detective. Like, that's the energy they give off. So,
Right. Fair enough.
but I think, I haven't, especially in Montreal, I don't think I've come across anyone who feels too Jewish to play different roles. And also,
Fair
like,
enough.
I guess to bring up too, like, to think of the reverse, like Judaism is such a vast thing, at least for me. It is a religion, it is culture, and should Jews not be allowed to be cast in Italian roles, which I've seen a lot. There is that.
And the other way around. Like even
Right.
in Mrs. Maisel, like the Tony Shalhoub, who's like Middle Eastern, I thought had the most authentic Jewish character from the non-Jewish actors. Like I thought he was Jewish. it was very believable. And to me, I was like, oh, I guess there's like more commonalities between someone, at least from the region. They'll understand a bit more than someone like Rachel Brosnahan, who she did a great job as Mrs. Maisel. I've like talked about this on my other podcast, Bonjour Chai, a lot. But it does like, it rubs me in a bit of a weird way just because of the fact that she's like the face of the show. She's the lead. And so many of my friends who aren't Jewish are aghast when I tell them that she's not. Like they just assume that she is.
She also
So
has
that,
such a Jewish
I don't
name,
know.
sort of like it,
Yeah,
you would
Rachel.
imagine. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know. I guess maybe I separate the art from the religion a bit, and I see the, like, it was well cast. Like it was not even something that I thought of truthfully, if I'm being like totally honest, and I love the show. And it was not some, like, it worked to me. So it wasn't something that was like, I think it's a problem
Jarring.
maybe when it doesn't work well. Right. And I
Yeah,
think
fair
that maybe
enough.
comes down to the consultants on shows. There's intimacy consultants now, and coordinators and stunt coordinators, like continuity people. Like if you're telling a Jewish story, maybe there should be a Jewish consultant, and making sure that the writing, and maybe there was, and I'm sure there was actually on that. But in other
I hope so.
productions, maybe that's
Yeah.
what's
I've seen
also
things that I'm
important.
like, what is happening? Like
Yeah.
I recently watched this like cheesy, cute Netflix Christmas TV show. Trying to remember the name right now. It'll come back to me. Dash and Lily. That's what it was. It was really cute.
Yeah.
And there was like this minor Jewish storyline because one of the writers is Jewish, even though it's a Christmas show. But I was like, who was missing on this set to let what these costume decisions were? Like at one point, they go into this underground like Jewish bar. The whole movie takes place, the whole series takes place in New York.
Yeah.
So that I bought. I was like, yeah, there probably is like these cool underground Jewish bars. But there was like men wearing seat and like black hats partying in like co-ed club vibes. I was like, that would not happen.
That wouldn't
And then
happen
later in the
unless
movie,
it
they go to
does, and
like
we
this.
just don't know about it.
Yeah, maybe like really hidden. And then at the end of the series, they go to like a Jonas Brothers Christmas concert in Central Park, and like those same dudes are there. I'm like, they're not going to a Christmas concert.
Oh my
This
God.
is like,
It's
like if they were
quick.
not wearing those like the seat and the hat, I would be like, okay, maybe like there's like a Jewish person who just loves the Jonas Brothers and they're just going even though they don't celebrate. But I was like, something just felt weird about that to me, where I was like, Jewish writer, but they clearly, like, the costume people didn't do their research. So
No, I feel like it
that's
wasn't
like
a Jewish writer. That's like quick. We need to quickly understand
add
that there's
something in.
Jews in this audience, so make them look religious or something, as if that's how
Yeah,
like all Jews
exactly.
look or something. So like that,
Yeah, it
yeah,
was
that to me
odd.
would bother me too, and that's like
Yeah.
problematic in terms of like, no, Hasidic men would not be in a bar. They would not be
Yeah,
socializing with women. That just doesn't happen.
exactly.
So that's a fact checking
Yeah.
problem, and that would irk me and bug me and be like, okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. So maybe that's the line. It's like when they do it in a way that like as a Jew, you're sitting there watching like, this doesn't sit right with me. Whether
Yeah.
it's like the acting choice, the costume, the writing. Fair enough.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up, what do you hope to see moving forward in regards to Jewish representation and casting?
Well, I mean, on a personal level, I would love to work on a Jewish story or help tell a Jewish story and get to cast a Jewish project. That would be very, very cool, and a nice culmination of my worlds.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I agree with, like, hopefully more Jewish stories are told, not about all of the disasters that we face, because I think Jews are so resilient and so positive, and great successes have come from our community, and Jews are funny. We use humor a lot to get through really, really tough times. So I think it would be great to tell more story through comedy.
Thank you so much, Jess.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your insights from the casting room. So, going on in Canada over the next few weeks, we have Power Gay with Daniel Ryan Spalding in Toronto, which starts on January 16th and closes on the 18th, presented by the Prosserman JCC. Power Gay is a vibrant exploration of LGBTQ plus culture and identity empowerment, deftly blending wit and storytelling to navigate the challenges of self-expression in a changing world. So be sure to check that out. If you're in the Toronto area, there's going to be a Q&A after the show with Daniel Ryan. And also in Toronto, the Miles Nadal JCC is doing an event, which if I was in Toronto, I would check out. It's called Restorative Creativity. So it's using the spiritual element of Shabbat as a time to slow down, but through art. So this event is being run by Sharoni Siboni, who's a community organizer, artist, and educator. You will be using the Jewish studio process, gathering in textual inquiry, art making, ground yourselves with restorative creativity, and let your minds wander with materials in hand, and nourish yourselves with deep play. That's happening in Toronto, downtown on January 20th, 2024 at the Miles Nadal JCC. Then we head over to Winnipeg. Gabs Sings Bab, starring Gabby Epstein. The Winnipeg Jewish Theatre is putting on this show January 20th and 21st. It is an homage to Barbara Streisand's greatest hits. Be sure to check that out, and we'll check in with David next time on the show. Thank you so much for listening. Culturally Jewish is hosted by me, Ilana Zakon. We're produced and edited by Michael Freeman, and our theme music is by Sarah Siegel-Lazar. We're a member of the CJN Podcast Network. To support our work and everything the CJN does, visit thecjn.ca/donate to make a monthly donation and receive a charitable tax receipt.